Officer Martin Delacroix had been with the New Orleans Police Department for 9 years when he walked into a situation that would destroy his career and cost the city $21.6 million. He was 37 years old enough to understand consequences, but apparently convinced that his authority was absolute. One Saturday morning outside a historic funeral home in the Garden District, he received a call from a concerned resident about a suspicious black man sitting in a luxury vehicle. The suspicious man was Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Beaumont, a 14-year federal prosecutor preparing to bury his father. What Delacroix did next, handcuffing him in his funeral suit, ignoring his federal credentials, and arresting him as mourners arrived for the service, would become proof of how assumptions based on race destroy lives, careers, and any remaining trust between law enforcement and the communities they're supposed to serve. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. Melanson and Sons. Funeral Home sits on Prytania Street in New Orleans' Garden District, a neighborhood of oak-lined streets, wrought iron fences, and antebellum mansions painted in pastels. It's the kind of place where old money lives, where garden parties happen in courtyards, where everything moves at the pace of Southern gentility. The funeral home itself is a restored Victorian mansion, painted cream with forest green shutters, surrounded by magnolia trees, and a parking lot that holds maybe 30 vehicles. It was 9:45 a.m. on a Saturday in late September. The air was thick and humid, the kind of heat that makes your shirt cling to your back. The morning sun filtered through Spanish moss hanging from the oak branches. Mourners were beginning to arrive for the 10:30 service. Marcus Beaumont had been sitting in his rental car for exactly 11 minutes. He'd arrived at 9:34 a.m., parked in the designated visitor lot, and called his mother to let her know he'd made it from the airport. He was early. He wanted a few minutes of quiet before walking into the funeral home, before facing his family, before standing at his father's casket and trying to find words. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit, white dress shirt, black tie, polished Oxfords. His carry-on bag was in the trunk. His briefcase was on the passenger seat. His federal credentials were in his inside jacket pocket where they always were. Marcus Beaumont was 42 years old. He'd been with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Louisiana for 14 years, spending his entire career prosecuting public corruption, white-collar crime, and civil rights violations. 14 years of building cases that other prosecutors avoided because they were too complex, too politically sensitive, or too likely to fail. He'd sent 3 city council members to federal prison for bribery, schemes that funneled public funds into private bank accounts. He'd dismantled a procurement fraud ring that cost Louisiana taxpayers $14 million. He'd prosecuted a police captain who'd been running a protection racket for illegal gambling operations. Cases that required thousands of hours combing through financial records, wiretap transcripts, and witness testimony. Cases where one missed detail could mean acquittal. Before joining the U.S. Attorney's Office, he'd spent 3 years as a litigator at Landry & Associates in Baton Rouge, handling commercial litigation and civil rights defense. He'd represented clients in breach of contract disputes worth millions, defended businesses against employment discrimination claims, and won summary judgment in cases that senior partners thought were headed for costly settlements. Before that, 2 years clerking for Judge Marianne Doucet of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Louisiana. 2 years watching federal trials, researching complex legal questions, drafting opinions on everything from securities fraud to constitutional violations. Judge Doucet called him the most thorough clerk she'd ever supervised. She'd written him a letter of recommendation that described him as having the analytical precision of a scholar and the practical instincts of a trial lawyer. Before that, 3 years at Tulane Law School, where he'd graduated Order of the Coif, the top 10% of his class. He'd been on Law Review, published a note on prosecutorial misconduct that was cited in a Fifth Circuit opinion, and won the moot court competition with an appellate argument on Fourth Amendment search and seizure law. His professors encouraged him to clerk for a federal appellate court, maybe even a Supreme Court justice. They saw federal judgeship potential. But Marcus wanted to prosecute. He wanted to hold powerful people accountable. He wanted to prove that the system worked when someone cared enough to make it work. He'd grown up in New Orleans East, the son of Raymond Beaumont, a postal worker who walked the same route for 32 years, and Celeste Beaumont, an elementary school teacher who spent her evenings tutoring kids who couldn't afford private help. They lived in a modest 3-bedroom house on a street where everyone knew everyone, where neighbors looked out for each other's kids, where college was something people talked about but didn't always achieve. Marcus was the first person in his family to graduate from a 4-year university, the first to go to law school, the first to wear a suit to work every day instead of a uniform. He'd been a scholarship kid at every level. Full ride to Xavier University of Louisiana for undergrad, where he'd majored in political science and graduated summa cum laude. Partial scholarship to Tulane Law, supplemented by loans he'd only finished paying off 5 years ago. He'd worked during law school as a research assistant for professors who needed someone to dig through case law and statutory history. He'd clerked during summers at the Orleans Public Defender's Office, where he'd learned what it looked like when the system failed people who couldn't afford better representation. That experience shaped everything. It taught him that prosecutors had power that most people never saw, and that power had to be used carefully. In high school, he'd been debate team captain, valedictorian, student body president. He'd believed in structures, in meritocracy, in the idea that if you followed the rules and worked harder than everyone else, you'd be rewarded. His father had told him that credentials would open doors. His mother had told him that education was the great equalizer. And for 42 years, Marcus Beaumont had lived like those lessons were true. At 42, he'd prosecuted cases that sent corrupt politicians to prison, dismantled fraud schemes that stole millions from federal programs, won convictions that other prosecutors said were unwinnable. His supervisors at the U.S. Attorney's Office called him relentless. His colleagues called him the prosecutor who never stopped building the case. Defense attorneys respected him because he didn't bring weak charges, and judges trusted him because he didn't exaggerate evidence. He'd testified before Congress twice, once on public corruption trends, and once on civil rights enforcement gaps in federal prosecution. He'd been featured in legal journals. He'd trained younger attorneys on trial strategy, evidence presentation, and witness examination. He was the prosecutor who volunteered for the hard cases, the ones that required 80-hour weeks and meticulous preparation. He'd won 37 of his 39 trials. The 2 he'd lost still bothered him. That Saturday morning, Marcus had flown in from Washington, D.C., where he'd been attending a Department of Justice conference on civil rights enforcement. The conference focused on patterns of police misconduct, prosecutorial strategies for Section 1983 claims, and the obstacles to holding law enforcement accountable. Marcus had presented a panel on evidence collection in excessive force cases. 3 days earlier, he'd gotten the call from his mother. "Your father is gone." Pancreatic cancer had taken Raymond Beaumont in 4 months. Diagnosis to death. Marcus had spoken to his father 3 days before the end, had flown down to see him in hospice, had held his hand and promised he'd take care of his mother. His father's last words to him had been, "You did good, son. Made us proud." Marcus had rearranged his schedule, asked for emergency leave from the conference, and caught a red-eye from D.C. to New Orleans. He'd landed at Louis Armstrong International at 8:20 a.m., picked up his rental car, a black Chrysler 300, and driven straight through the city to the Garden District. Traffic had been light. He'd taken I-10 to Carrollton Avenue, turned onto St. Charles, and wound through the tree-lined streets until he reached Prytania. He'd pulled into the funeral home parking lot at 9:34 a.m., called his mother to let her know he'd arrived, and then sat in the car, gathering himself. He was tired. The red-eye had been turbulent. He'd tried to sleep, but couldn't. He kept thinking about his father's funeral, about the eulogy he'd written but wasn't sure he could deliver, about standing in front of 100 people and trying to summarize a life in 5 minutes. He was thinking about his mother, who'd been married to Raymond for 47 years, and now had to figure out how to live without him. He was thinking about the program he'd helped his sister design, about the photos they'd selected, about the hymns his father had requested. He wasn't thinking about what he looked like sitting in that car, a 42-year-old black man in a luxury vehicle in the Garden District on a Saturday morning. He wasn't thinking about how someone might perceive that. because Marcus Beaumont had spent his entire adult life earning credentials that were supposed to make profiling impossible. Federal prosecutor, Justice Department badge, cases won against powerful defendants. He'd believed those things meant something. He was about to learn they meant nothing to the person watching him from across the street. Officer Martin Delacroix had been with the New Orleans Police Department for 9 years. 9 years responding to calls, 9 years patrolling neighborhoods, 9 years building what he called instincts about when something didn't look right. He was 37 years old, married, father of 2, a former Marine who'd served 1 tour in Iraq before joining the police force. His personnel file included commendations for bravery, efficiency ratings that called him dedicated, and 11 complaints. 11 complaints in 9 years. That's not bad luck. That's a pattern. 2017. Complaint filed by Jerome Washington, a cardiologist, after Delacroix stopped him outside his own home in Lakeview and demanded proof of residence. Washington had been carrying groceries from his car to his front door. The complaint was dismissed after Delacroix claimed he was responding to a burglary call, even though dispatch records showed no such call. Conflict resolution training recommended. 2018. Complaint filed by Shanice Morris, a software engineer, after Delacroix questioned her in the parking lot of a Whole Foods in Uptown. Morris had been loading groceries into her Tesla when Delacroix approached and asked if the vehicle was hers. When she asked why it mattered, Delacroix ran her plates and asked for her driver's license. The complaint alleged racial profiling. Delacroix claimed he thought the vehicle matched a description of a stolen car, though no such report existed. Conflict resolution training required. 2019. Complaint filed by Andre Coleman, a financial analyst, after Delacroix detained him for 20 minutes outside a restaurant in the French Quarter. Coleman had been waiting for his wife at the valet stand when Delacroix approached and asked what he was doing there. When Coleman asked if there was a problem, Delacroix accused him of loitering and demanded identification. The complaint was closed after Delacroix claimed Coleman had been acting suspiciously, though security footage showed Coleman standing calmly, checking his phone. Remedial training ordered. 2020. Complaint filed by Dr. Simone Harris, a pediatrician, after Delacroix stopped her while she was jogging in Audubon Park. Harris had been running on the designated path when Delacroix pulled his patrol car alongside and asked where she was going. When Harris asked why she was being stopped, Delacroix claimed there had been reports of suspicious activity in the area. No such reports existed. Training recommended. 2021. Complaint filed by Kenneth Price, an architect, after Delacroix questioned him outside a bank in the Central Business District. Price had been depositing a check when Delacroix approached and asked where he'd gotten the money. Price filed a formal complaint alleging harassment. Delacroix was assigned to additional training on community policing. 2022. Complaint filed by Danielle Laurent, a law professor, after Delacroix detained her outside her child's school. Laurent had been waiting in the pickup line when Delacroix approached her vehicle and asked if she was authorized to be there. When Laurent asked why she was being questioned, Delacroix claimed he was verifying parent identification. Laurent was the only black parent questioned that day. Additional training required. 11 complaints, 9 years. All 11 involving black professionals in predominantly white areas. All 11 dismissed or resolved with training that Delacroix apparently never internalized. Because by September 2023, Officer Martin Delacroix still believed that when he saw a black person in an affluent neighborhood, his instinct to question them was justified. And that belief was about to collide with a federal prosecutor who'd spent 14 years holding people like Delacroix accountable. At 9:45 a.m., Delacroix was patrolling Prytania Street when he received a call from dispatch. Concerned citizen reports suspicious person in vehicle outside funeral home. Black male, luxury sedan, appears to be casing the area. The caller was Mrs. Eugenia Whitmore, 68, a longtime Garden District resident who lived across the street from Melanson and Sons. She'd been watering her plants on her front porch when she noticed a black man sitting in a black car in the funeral home parking lot. To Mrs. Whitmore, this didn't fit. Black people didn't attend funerals at Melanson and Sons. That's what she told dispatch. I've lived here 30 years. I know who belongs here. This man doesn't belong. Delacroix arrived at the funeral home at 9:47 a.m. He parked his patrol car behind the Chrysler 300, blocking it in. He approached the driver's side window, hand resting on his service weapon, and knocked on the glass. Marcus lowered the window. "You need to step away from this vehicle." "Excuse me." "What's the problem, officer?" "We received a report of a suspicious vehicle." "Are you authorized to be here?" "Authorized? I'm attending my father's funeral. The service is in 20 minutes. "Whose funeral?" "Raymond Beaumont." "My father." "I'm his son." "Where are you coming from?" "Washington, D.C. I flew in this morning. This is my rental car. Let me see your rental agreement." Marcus reached for the glove compartment. Delacroix's hand moved to his weapon. Slowly, Marcus retrieved the rental agreement, handed it through the window. Delacroix glanced at it, barely reading the details. Handed it back. "Step out of the vehicle." "Why?" "I've shown you my rental agreement. I've explained why I'm here. My father's funeral is in the building right there. What's the issue?" "Step out of the vehicle. Now." This is where reasonable questions become commands. This is where a grieving son becomes a suspect, because a police officer has decided that his presence, his explanation, his rental agreement, none of it matters. Delacroix had already made his assessment. Black man, luxury car, affluent neighborhood. Suspicious. And nothing Marcus said was going to change that assessment, because Delacroix had been making the same assessment for 9 years without consequence. Marcus Beaumont was a federal prosecutor. He knew his rights. He knew he had no legal obligation to exit his vehicle without reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. He knew that sitting in a parking lot where you're authorized to be isn't grounds for detention. But Marcus Beaumont also knew what happened when black men argued with police officers. He'd prosecuted enough excessive force cases to know that asserting your rights could escalate into violence. So he made the calculation that every black professional in America has to make. Comply now, fight later. He opened the door. He stepped out. Delacroix told him to place his hands on the roof of the car. Marcus complied. "Officer, I'm a federal prosecutor. My credentials are in my jacket. May I reach for them?" Hands on the car. "My name is Marcus Beaumont. I'm an Assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Louisiana. My credentials are in my inside jacket pocket. If you'll allow me to retrieve them, I can show you exactly who I am. I don't care who you are. Hands where I can see them." This is where credentials become irrelevant. This is where education, career, reputation, all of it dissolves because the person with power has decided it doesn't matter. Delacroix didn't care if Marcus was a prosecutor, a doctor, a CEO. He'd already decided Marcus was suspicious, and admitting he was wrong would require reconsidering everything he'd done for the past 9 years. Marcus placed his hands on the car. Delacroix began patting him down, running his hands over Marcus's jacket, checking his pockets, treating a federal prosecutor like a suspect. By now, other mourners were arriving. Sharon Miller, a family friend who'd known Marcus since he was a child, walked past carrying a bouquet of flowers. She saw Marcus against the car, saw the police officer, and froze. "Marcus, what's happening?" Delacroix turned, his hand still on Marcus's shoulder. "Ma'am, keep moving. That's Marcus Beaumont. He's here for his father's funeral. What are you doing to him?" "Ma'am, if you don't step back, you'll be detained as well." Sharon pulled out her phone, started recording. Delacroix noticed but didn't tell her to stop. Not yet. An elderly couple, the Thibodeaus, who'd been friends with Raymond Beaumont for decades, paused near the funeral home entrance. Mr. Thibodeau, 74, a retired postal worker who'd worked alongside Raymond, saw what was happening and started walking toward the patrol car. "What the hell is this?" Delacroix looked up. "Sir, step back. That's Ray's son. We're here for Ray's funeral. You got him against a car like he's a criminal? Sir, I need you to step back right now." By now, more cars were pulling into the parking lot. Marcus's cousin, David Beaumont, arrived with his wife and 2 daughters. He saw Marcus with his hands on the car, saw the officer patting him down, and immediately got out of his car. "Marcus, what's going on?" Delacroix turned again, his patience wearing thin. "Sir, step back. That's my cousin. We're here for the same funeral, Uncle Ray's funeral. Why do you have him against the car?" "I said step back or you'll be detained." David pulled out his phone, started recording. Now there were two cameras. Delacroix noticed. His jaw tightened. Put the phone away. No, you're detaining my cousin for no reason. I'm recording this. This is obstruction. Obstruction of what? You're the one obstructing. We're trying to attend a funeral. By now, 6 more people had gathered near the funeral home entrance. Marcus's aunt, Lorraine, his uncle Thomas, 3 family friends, and 2 other mourners who didn't know Marcus but recognized injustice when they saw it. Reverend Thomas Beaumont, Marcus's uncle and the officiant for the funeral, came out of the building. He was wearing his clerical collar, his Bible in hand. He saw his nephew against the car and hurried over, his voice sharp with authority. "Officer, what's happening here?" "Sir, I need you to step back. That's my nephew. We're burying his father today. What has he done? He's being detained for questioning." Detained for what? For sitting in a car in a parking lot? For being early to his own father's funeral? I received a call about a suspicious person. Suspicious? He's wearing a suit. He's here for a funeral. What about that is suspicious? Do you think officers should need more than a suspicious person call to detain someone? Drop your answer below. Delacroix didn't answer. He'd already committed. He'd already escalated. The crowd was growing. The cameras were recording. And backing down now would be admitting he'd made a mistake. So he doubled down. Everyone needs to step back or I'll call for additional units. Marcus kept his hands on the car. His voice stayed calm, measured, even as his heart pounded and humiliation burned through him. "Officer, may I please reach for my credentials? They're in my jacket, inside pocket, left side. I can show you exactly who I am. I can show you my federal ID. I can show you my Justice Department badge. I can verify everything I've told you." Delacroix hesitated. He glanced at the crowd, at the phones recording, at Reverend Beaumont staring at him with barely contained fury. He'd painted himself into a corner. If he let Marcus reach for his credentials and they proved everything Marcus had said, Delacroix would look foolish. If he refused and this escalated further, he'd look worse. So he made the choice that would end his career and cost the city $21.6 million. Turn around. Hands behind your back. Wait. What are you doing? You're being detained. For what? I haven't committed a crime. I've identified myself. I've explained why I'm here. I've shown you my rental agreement. Trespassing and obstruction. Trespassing? I'm attending my father's funeral. I have documentation. I've been cooperative. How am I trespassing? Hands behind your back. Last warning. Marcus turned around, slowly, carefully, and placed his hands behind his back. And in that moment, every person in that parking lot understood what they were watching. Sharon Miller's hand trembled as she held her phone, recording. David's voice cracked as he kept filming, repeating over and over, "This is wrong. This is wrong." Reverend Beaumont's face went pale with rage. Mr. Thibodeau, a man who'd worked alongside federal agents during his postal career, who'd respected law enforcement his entire life, felt something break inside him as he watched a federal prosecutor being handcuffed at his father's funeral for the crime of being black in the Garden District. Marcus Beaumont, a federal prosecutor who'd spent 14 years putting criminals in prison, felt handcuffs close around his wrists in the parking lot of his father's funeral home. He felt the metal bite into his skin, cold and tight. He heard his uncle shouting, his voice breaking. He saw his cousin still recording, tears streaming down his face. He saw Sharon Miller with her hand over her mouth. He saw the Thibodeaus, horrified. He saw strangers staring, and he realized that every credential he'd earned, every case he'd won, every rule he'd followed, meant absolutely nothing to the officer standing behind him. Because to Officer Martin Delacroix, Marcus Beaumont wasn't a federal prosecutor. He wasn't a lawyer who'd spent 14 years holding corrupt officials accountable. He wasn't a son preparing to bury his father. He was a black man in a place where Delacroix had decided he didn't belong. And that assumption, repeated 11 times over 9 years without consequence, had finally collided with someone who had the resources, the knowledge, and the determination to make it the last time Delacroix ever wore a badge. At 9:52 a.m., Lieutenant Angela Broussard, a 22-year veteran of the New Orleans Police Department, arrived at the funeral home. She'd been in the area when she heard the dispatch about the suspicious person call. When she heard Delacroix request backup for a detention, she decided to respond herself. She pulled into the parking lot, saw Marcus in handcuffs, saw the crowd of witnesses, and knew immediately something was wrong. Delacroix. What's going on? Lieutenant? Subject was acting suspiciously, refused to comply. I wasn't refusing. I was trying to show him my credentials. Broussard looked at Marcus, saw the funeral suit, saw the obvious distress on his face, and then looked at the funeral home. She walked over to Delacroix. What was he doing? Sitting in the vehicle. That's it? He matched the description from the call. What description? Blackmail in a luxury vehicle. Broussard closed her eyes for a moment, then turned to Marcus. Sir, what's your name? Marcus Beaumont, Assistant U.S. Attorney, Eastern District of Louisiana. My credentials are in my inside jacket pocket. May I see them? If someone will remove these handcuffs, I'll show you. Broussard looked at Delacroix, her expression saying everything she couldn't say out loud. She walked over to Marcus, reached into his jacket, and pulled out his credentials. Federal ID, Justice Department badge. She opened the credential case, saw his photo, saw the gold badge, and understood exactly what kind of disaster Delacroix had just created. She turned to Delacroix. Uncuff him. Now. Lieutenant, Uncuff him. That's an order. Delacroix uncuffed Marcus. Broussard handed him back his credentials. Mr. Beaumont, I apologize. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Your officer handcuffed me in the parking lot of my father's funeral based on a call that I was suspicious for sitting in a car. I understand you're upset. Upset? I'm a federal prosecutor. I've prosecuted civil rights cases. I know exactly what just happened here. And so do the 20 people who watched it happen. And so does the camera that recorded it. Broussard looked at David, still filming. She looked at the crowd of witnesses, at Reverend Beaumont, at the other mourners. She looked at Marcus, his eyes furious, his hands shaking as he straightened his tie. And she made the decision that would save the department from something even worse. Officer Delacroix, give me your badge. What? Your badge. Your service weapon. Now. Lieutenant, I was responding to a call. You handcuffed a federal prosecutor at his father's funeral, based on a suspicious call that described him as a black man in a nice car. Give me your badge and go wait in your patrol car. You're suspended pending investigation. Delacroix stared at her. Then he unclipped his badge, handed it over. He walked to his patrol car. Broussard turned back to Marcus. Mr. Beaumont, again, I sincerely apologize. If there's anything I can do, there's nothing you can do. My father's funeral starts in 30 minutes. I'm going inside now. Marcus walked toward the funeral home. His uncle put an arm around him. His cousin was still recording. And in his patrol car, Martin Delacroix sat with his hands on the steering wheel, watching his career collapse in real time. By Monday morning, the video had 300,000 views on Twitter. David Beaumont had posted it Saturday afternoon, right after the funeral, with a caption that went viral. My cousin is a federal prosecutor. He was handcuffed at our uncle's funeral for sitting in a rental car while black. Officer's name, Martin Delacroix. Badge number, 4782. This is the Garden District, New Orleans. This is 2023. Nothing has changed. The video showed everything. Marcus in his funeral suit, hands on the car. Delacroix's aggressive commands. Reverend Beaumont's furious questions. The handcuffs. The crowd of horrified witnesses. Sharon Miller's footage, uploaded separately, showed a different angle, wider, capturing the funeral home entrance, with its sign announcing Raymond Beaumont's service at 10:30 a.m., capturing the entire context that Delacroix had ignored. By Tuesday morning, every local news station in Louisiana had picked up the story. WDSU led with federal prosecutor detained at father's funeral. WWL-TV ran a segment titled Racial Profiling in the Garden District, Fox 8 interviewed civil rights attorneys who called the arrest textbook Fourth Amendment violation. The Times-Picayune published an investigation titled Pattern of Complaints: Officer Delacroix's 9-year record. The article detailed all 11 complaints. It included interviews with 5 of the complainants. Dr. Jerome Washington, the cardiologist stopped outside his own home in 2017, said he'd filed his complaint and never heard back. The department sent me a letter saying the matter was resolved. Resolved how? With training? He's still out there stopping black people. Shanice Morris, the software engineer questioned in the Whole Foods parking lot, said she'd been terrified. I showed him my registration. I showed him my license. He treated me like I'd stolen my own car. When I complained, they said he thought my Tesla matched a stolen vehicle description. There was no stolen Tesla. They lied to protect him. By Wednesday, national news had picked it up. CNN ran a segment during their morning show. MSNBC interviewed Marcus's attorney. The Washington Post published an op-ed titled, When Credentials Don't Matter, the Marcus Beaumont Case. USA Today covered it under the headline, Federal Prosecutor Handcuffed at Funeral Exposes Systemic Profiling. Legal analysts on cable news called it one of the clearest examples of racial profiling they'd seen. Former prosecutors said Delacroix's conduct violated every standard of reasonable suspicion. Civil rights advocates pointed out that Marcus had offered his credentials multiple times and been ignored. One commentator on CNN said what everyone was thinking. If being a federal prosecutor doesn't protect you from being profiled, what does? What credentials do you need? What job do you have to have? Or does none of it matter if you're black in a place someone decided you don't belong? The New Orleans Police Department, now facing national scrutiny, held a press conference. Superintendent Michael Harrison stood at a podium and read a prepared statement. We are aware of the incident involving Officer Martin Delacroix and Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Beaumont. The matter is under internal investigation. Officer Delacroix has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of that investigation. We take allegations of misconduct seriously and are committed to holding our officers accountable. Questions from reporters were brutal. How did an officer with 11 complaints stay on patrol? Why wasn't Delacroix's pattern of behavior flagged? What training did Delacroix receive after previous complaints? Harrison deflected most of them, repeating that the investigation was ongoing. But the damage was done. The department looked incompetent at best, complicit at worst. Marcus Beaumont, still grieving his father, watched the media coverage from his mother's house in New Orleans East. He hadn't planned to sue. He'd planned to file a formal complaint, maybe write an op-ed, then return to Washington and his cases. But his attorney, Camille Devereaux, who'd been a friend since law school, and now ran one of the most successful civil rights firms in Louisiana, called him Tuesday morning. Marcus, you need to sue, not just for you. For everyone Delacroix has done this to. For everyone who couldn't fight back. For everyone who didn't have a camera. Marcus spent 2 days thinking about it. Then he made the decision. On September 26th, 3 weeks after the funeral, Marcus Beaumont filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Officer Martin Delacroix and the city of New Orleans. The complaint, 47 pages long, was a prosecutor's masterpiece. It detailed the stop, the detention, the handcuffing, minute by minute, using the video evidence, witness statements, and dispatch recordings. It laid out Delacroix's 11 prior complaints, documenting the dates, the complainants' names, the allegations, and the department's responses. It quoted from the department's own training materials on racial profiling and reasonable suspicion, showing how Delacroix had violated every policy. It cited federal case law on Fourth Amendment protections, on qualified immunity standards, on supervisory liability. And it named not just Delacroix, but the city of New Orleans for failure to train, failure to supervise, and deliberate indifference to a pattern of constitutional violations. The damages requested, $22 million, compensatory damages for emotional distress, humiliation, reputational harm, punitive damages against Delacroix personally, attorney fees, and injunctive relief requiring systemic reforms to prevent this from happening again. The city's initial response was predictable. They filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that Delacroix had reasonable suspicion based on the dispatch call, that Marcus had been uncooperative, that the detention was brief and nonviolent, and that qualified immunity protected Delacroix from personal liability. Their motion claimed Marcus had failed to state a claim for which relief could be granted. It was a standard defense in police misconduct cases. But Judge Elaine Morrison, who'd been on the federal bench for 18 years and had a reputation for not tolerating nonsense, denied the motion in a 12-page order that became required reading in civil rights clinics. The court finds that plaintiff has adequately alleged a Fourth Amendment violation. A federal prosecutor sitting in a rental car in a funeral home parking lot before his father's funeral does not present reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. The fact that Officer Delacroix received a dispatch call describing plaintiff only as a black male in a luxury vehicle does not transform plaintiff's lawful presence into reasonable suspicion. Race is not a crime. Wealth is not a crime. Being in a place where someone thinks you don't belong is not a crime. The motion to dismiss is denied. Do you think qualified immunity should protect officers who ignore someone's credentials and detain them based solely on a biased 911 call? Drop your answer below. Discovery began in December. Depositions, document requests, interrogatories. Camille Devereux subpoenaed Delacroix's entire personnel file, every complaint, every training record, every performance evaluation. She deposed Mrs. Eugenia Whitmore, the caller, who admitted under oath that she'd called police because she didn't think black people attended funerals at Melanson and Sons, because in 30 years, she'd never seen a black person in that parking lot, because she assumed Marcus was casing the building for a burglary. She deposed Delacroix, who spent 6 hours trying to justify his actions and couldn't explain why he'd ignored Marcus's repeated offers to show credentials. She deposed Lieutenant Broussard, who testified that she'd immediately recognized the stop was unlawful, that she'd confiscated Delacroix's badge because she knew the city would be sued, and that she'd recommended Delacroix's termination the same day. She deposed the 5 complainants from Delacroix's prior incidents, who described identical patterns, stopped for being black in white neighborhoods, questioned without cause, treated as suspects despite providing identification. The city's attorneys tried to settle in March, 4 months before trial. They offered $500,000. Marcus refused. They offered $2 million. Marcus refused. They offered $5 million. Marcus told Camille he wasn't settling unless the offer included Delacroix's termination and systemic reforms. The city balked. They didn't want to admit their oversight system had failed. They didn't want to create a review board that could second-guess supervisors. So they prepared for trial. But in May, something changed. The Department of Justice opened an investigation into the New Orleans Police Department's pattern of racial profiling, triggered by Marcus's case and a series of similar complaints. Federal investigators requested records on every stop Delacroix had made in 9 years, every complaint against every officer in the department, every use of force incident involving black suspects. The city realized they weren't just facing a $22 million lawsuit. They were facing a federal consent decree that could cost tens of millions and require oversight for years. On June 18, 2024, 9 months after Marcus was handcuffed at his father's funeral, the city called Camille with a settlement offer. $21.6 million. Termination of Officer Martin Delacroix, effective immediately. Mandatory retraining for the entire police department on racial profiling, implicit bias, and de-escalation. Creation of an independent civilian review board to investigate complaints involving officers with 3 or more complaints of discriminatory conduct. Public apology from the city. Marcus accepted. Not because the money mattered, but because the reforms did. Because maybe the next person Delacroix would have stopped wouldn't have to go through what he did. Because maybe the next officer with 11 complaints would be removed before number 12. Marcus Beaumont donated $2 million of the settlement to the New Orleans Legal Defense Fund, an organization providing free legal representation to residents who'd experienced police misconduct. He returned to his job at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, and 6 weeks after the settlement, he testified before the New Orleans City Council during a public hearing on police accountability, His testimony, delivered without notes, lasted 11 minutes. Excerpts were played on every news station in Louisiana. I'm here today not as a federal prosecutor, but as someone who learned that my credentials mean nothing when an officer has already decided I don't belong. On September 23, 2023, I arrived at my father's funeral early. I wanted a few quiet minutes before saying goodbye to the man who taught me that hard work and credentials would protect me. I was wrong. He was wrong. Because when Officer Martin Delacroix saw me sitting in that rental car, he didn't see a federal prosecutor. He didn't see a son grieving his father. He saw a black man in a luxury vehicle in the Garden District, and he decided that was suspicious. I offered my credentials multiple times. I explained I was attending a funeral. I showed my rental agreement. None of it mattered. I was handcuffed in front of my family, in my funeral suit, while my father's casket waited inside. I won my case because I'm a federal prosecutor who knows the law and had the resources to fight. But I think about the 11 people who complained about Officer Delacroix before me. Dr. Jerome Washington, stopped outside his own home. Shanice Morris, questioned in a parking lot. Andre Coleman, detained for waiting for his wife. Dr. Simone Harris, stopped while jogging. Kenneth Price, questioned outside a bank. Danielle Laurent, questioned at her child's school. They filed complaints. They followed the process. And nothing changed. Because the system that was supposed to hold Delacroix accountable failed. It sent him to training that he ignored. It documented his pattern and did nothing. And when he handcuffed me at my father's funeral, he believed he'd get away with it again, because he'd gotten away with it 11 times before. My settlement changes nothing unless we change the system that allowed it. $21.6 million is taxpayer money. It's your money. The city paid it because they failed to supervise an officer who'd been complained about 11 times in 9 years. That's not one bad apple. That's institutional failure. So I'm asking you, as elected officials who represent this city, to ensure that the reforms in my settlement are implemented fully and permanently. Create the Civilian Review Board with real investigative power. Require termination for officers with 3 or more sustained complaints of discriminatory conduct. Make training mandatory and measure whether it changes behavior, not just whether officers attend. Because if we don't fix the system, we're just waiting for the next person to be profiled, the next family to watch their son handcuffed, the next $21 million settlement that solves nothing. The hearing room was silent when Marcus finished. 3 council members thanked him for his testimony. 2 committed to supporting the reforms. 1 asked him how he'd maintained his composure during the detention. Marcus's answer was brief. I maintained my composure because losing it could have gotten me killed. That's what every black person in America learns. Stay calm. Comply. Fight later. Because fighting in the moment, asserting your rights, reminding an officer that you're a human being, all of that can escalate into violence. So we stay calm. We take the humiliation, and we hope we survive to file the complaint that probably won't change anything. That's the reality. That's what needs to change. Do you think officers with 3 or more sustained complaints of discriminatory conduct should face automatic termination? Drop your answer below. 3 months after the settlement, Officer Martin Delacroix gave an interview to a local news station. He claimed he'd been following protocol. He claimed he'd responded to a legitimate call. He claimed race had nothing to do with his decision to detain Marcus Beaumont. The reporter, doing her job, pressed him. Officer Delacroix, you had 11 prior complaints, all involving black professionals in affluent neighborhoods. How do you explain that pattern? Delacroix shifted in his seat. Those complaints were investigated and resolved. I received training. And what? Did that training teach you? That I need to be more aware of community concerns. The reporter leaned forward. Mr. Beaumont offered his federal credentials multiple times. Why didn't you verify them? Delacroix's jaw tightened. In that moment, I assessed the situation and determined that a further investigation was warranted. But he showed you his rental agreement. He explained he was attending his father's funeral. What investigation was necessary? I was following my training and my instincts. Your instincts told you a federal prosecutor at his father's funeral was suspicious? Delacroix didn't answer. The reporter asked one more question. Have you apologized to Marcus Beaumont? Delacroix looked directly at the camera. "I have nothing to apologize for. I was doing my job. That interview, broadcast on a Tuesday evening in September, ended any chance of Delacroix finding work in law enforcement again. No department would hire an officer who'd cost a city $21.6 million and then publicly refused to acknowledge wrongdoing. No chief wanted the liability. No union could defend the optics. Martin Delacroix, 37 years old, 9 years on the force, was done. Marcus Beaumont returned to his job as a federal prosecutor. He continued prosecuting corruption, fraud, and civil rights cases. But something had fundamentally changed. He'd spent 14 years believing that credentials mattered, that systems worked, that if you earned your place, you'd be protected. He'd believed his father's lesson that education was the equalizer, that a federal badge would shield him from the assumptions that killed so many others. Now he knew better. Now he understood that to some people, a badge and a title meant nothing if the person holding them didn't look like what they expected. And that understanding made him more relentless, more determined, more focused on holding accountable the people who abused power because they assumed no one would challenge them. He prosecuted with a fury he hadn't possessed before. He took cases other prosecutors avoided. He pushed for maximum sentences when the evidence warranted it, because he'd learned that accountability wasn't automatic. It had to be fought for. And he'd rather fight than watch another officer compile 11 complaints without consequence. Delacroix's career is over. That's consequence. The city paid $21.6 million. That's accountability. The reforms are in place, the Civilian Review Board is operational, and the training protocols have been updated. That's progress. But the system that allowed an officer with 11 complaints to keep patrolling, to keep stopping black people in white neighborhoods, to keep assuming that someone didn't belong based solely on their race, that system is still in place across thousands of police departments nationwide. And until we dismantle the structures that protect officers like Martin Delacroix, until we create real consequences for patterns of discriminatory behavior, until we stop treating each incident as an isolated mistake instead of evidence of systemic failure, settlements like Marcus Beaumont's are just expensive apologies. They're not solutions. They're band-aids on broken bones. The real question is, what changes now? Not in New Orleans, where reforms were purchased with $21.6 million and a national humiliation, but in every other city where officers with multiple complaints continue patrolling. In every other department where training is a checkbox instead of a mandate for change. In every other municipality where officials weigh the cost of reform against the cost of the next settlement and decide to wait. Because if we don't fix the system that allowed Martin Delacroix to compile 11 complaints over 9 years without facing termination, if we don't hold departments accountable for ignoring patterns they should have stopped years earlier, if we keep sending officers to conflict resolution training instead of removing them from positions where they can harm people, then we're just waiting for the next Marcus Beaumont, the next federal prosecutor handcuffed at his father's funeral, the next doctor stopped outside her own home, the next engineer questioned in a parking lot, the next professional told that their credentials mean nothing because someone decided they don't belong. And here's what's most damning. Marcus Beaumont won because he had resources, because he knew the law, because he had an attorney who'd take the case, because he had a platform and the ability to fight. But for every Marcus Beaumont who wins a settlement, there are hundreds of Jerome Washingtons, Shanice Morrises, and Andre Colemans who file complaints that disappear into departmental bureaucracy, who are told the matter was resolved, who watch the officer who profiled them continue working, who learn that the system protects power, not people. That's the real crisis. Not that Marcus was handcuffed, but that without his credentials, his resources, and his knowledge, he'd have been just another complaint that changed nothing. If you found this story important, please subscribe, share this video, leave a comment about your own experiences or what reforms you think are necessary, because stories like these need to be heard. And accountability starts with awareness. What happened to Marcus Beaumont was wrong. What happened to the 11 people who complained about Martin Delacroix before him was wrong. And what will happen to the next person stopped Because an officer assumes they don't belong, we'll be wrong unless we demand better. Unless we make it impossible for officers to compile complaint after complaint without consequence. Unless we decide that training isn't enough when the problem is the officer, not their education. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.